Welcome everyone to the next instalment of the Oracle Apex office hours. We're here today to talk to you about dynamic actions in Application Express. Some of you may be new to dynamic actions. Some of you may be very familiar with dynamic actions. I hope to give you a little bit of something for everyone here. So the examples will kind of build in complexity. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. My name is Anthony Rayner. I work for the Apex development team, have done since just over 10 years, since 2008, and transferred over from Oracle Consulting after joining Oracle in 2005. I'm a principal member of technical staff, worked primarily on the client side for the last sort of 2 or 3 years. Developed dynamic actions with some other people for Apex 4.0, and then in more recent releases, Page Designer and Interactive Grid work. I'm also the accessibility lead for the team, so I take care of accessibility testing, ensuring that Apex is both accessible to developers who need it to be, but also for users of Apex applications that they get a good user experience as well. That's me. Just the standard Oracle Safe Harbor slide. There will be a little bit of discussion about some future plans for dynamic actions in future releases at the end. Please don't make any buying decisions based on what we discussed today. So, dynamic actions. We're going to give you a quick overview of what they are, their structure, and what they can do. We're going to go into some demos for about 20-25 minutes. Thanks, David. Section of the presentation. We're going to look at some bad practice examples. So these are things that have come up over the years, just where life can be a bit more tricky than it should be in terms of certain things that happen. So just a few things to steer clear of, and also the future direction as discussed. So first, an overview. So what are dynamic actions? They're declarative client-side development without needing to know JavaScript, although there are places where it is helpful. So certainly the main emphasis of the feature of dynamic actions is to enable you to kind of work on the client side, provide a more interactive and a user interface with great usability without needing to get your hands dirty with JavaScript. That said, there are a number of places in the framework in dynamic actions where you can provide custom JavaScript. And there are great opportunities for example, plugin developers to code dynamic action plugins with JavaScript and PL SQL, just to kind of and make things easier in terms of sort of modularization of code and such. We'll come on a bit more into that later on. So primarily declarative, but there are a few places where it's useful to know a little bit of jQuery and a little bit of JavaScript syntax. So they were introduced in Apex 4.0. They're very much event driven. That's how I always sort of try and explain it, is sort of about stuff happening on the page. So when certain events occur on the page, then you can react with a number of different actions. So you can update other parts of the page. You can hide and show stuff. You can update different content dynamically. We'll come on to loads of examples later on. Basically very much event driven, and then a host of available actions in order to update your user interface. Both events and actions are, they're not fixed, so they are extensible with plugins. Plugin actions are dynamic action plugins, and there's a whole host of those available already on Apex World on GitHub. I'm going to show one of those a little bit later as an example of what's possible with dynamic actions and plugins, because it's not just about the kind of sort of show hide kind of case. There's a whole world of opportunity. And also events. So not explicit event plugins, but component types can have events. So for example, the interactive grid region or a custom plugin region that a plugin developer has authored can add events to that plugin, and they will be exposed in Page Designer and Apex for the plugin users to use in their pages. So they're both not fixed and both extensible through the plugin architecture. As I said, there's a number of JavaScript hooks where you can kind of extend further the basic native functionality available within Dynamic Actions. And they're debuggable, so you can debug via the browser console. They are client-side, so it's not sort of, it's a bit different to traditional debugging in Apex, but it is enabled through the same switch. So in the developer toolbar, there's a debug option, you enable debug, and that enables server-side debugging, but it also enables some output to the browser console, which enables you to see what's happening, what's firing when, and there's some additional information within the console output to help you kind of work out what's going on. Can be very useful in terms of during development and also to debug issues. So let's have a look at the anatomy of a dynamic action. What does it look like? So there's three simple parts. There's the when something happens, the action, and the affected elements. So the when is basically when something happens, when an item value changes, when a button is clicked, when a dialog closes, something happens on the page. So that's when. Then there's the action, which describes what happens. So the common ones might be disable, hide, refresh, set value, or if it's that's where it's extensible, there could be plugin actions. So your own plugins can provide the action within Dynamic Actions. And finally, the affected elements. So what does the action influence? So so the item that's disabled, the report that's hidden, or the chart that's refreshed. Okay, cool. So that's a basic overview. Now we're going to spend a good amount of time going through some different demos. So let's have a look. Okay, so the first thing which we're going to show is a very simple example, a disable and enable dynamic action, just to get started. So we can see it working first. So here, if we change the job select list, there's a dynamic action defined to fire on change. So it's firing when the item changes. And when the item changes, we are enabling, which is the action, the hire date and the commission page items. When the job is not equal to salesman, then we disable those fields. So it's when the item changes, we enable or disable those items on the page. And let's have a look at that in Page Designer. Okay, so in Page Designer, we have the rendering tree on the left. I've laid out my page. As you may know, Page Designer is configurable in terms of its layout. When working with Dynamic Actions, I find it helpful to kind of put the property editor next to the rendering tree because I'm not so concerned with layout when dealing with Dynamic Actions. You can also pop the help on the right, so as you move through the fields in the property editor, you immediately get the help. And that can be helpful when you're looking at certain attributes of the dynamic action. For example, the event. We can immediately see what the different event categorization is, for example. So yeah, this is the dynamic action that deals with the disabling and enabling. We can see it in the rendering tree directly under the when item. So when this item changes. In this case, it is when the P3 job item changes. There's also a condition in this case, a client-side condition, which basically says, allows you to control the true and false actions. So you can say, perform certain actions when the condition is true, when, in this case, job is equal to salesman, or you can do the opposite, and when it's not equal to salesman, do some other actions. So in this case, we've got job equals salesman. There are a number of other sort of declarative condition types there, depending on your requirements. And then if we drill a little bit more into the action, we can see we've got our true action, which is when this is true. That's enable. In this case, we're enabling 2 page items on the page. You don't need to have separate actions for multiple items using the same action type. So yeah, so we can list anything that we want to be enabled. And then in the false action, which is when job is not equal to salesman, then we can do the same but opposite. So we can disable those page items. Okay, let's have a look at another example. So let's create one. So if we go to the hide and show page, and we can see here that we want the same kind of thing, but hiding and showing instead of disabling and enabling. So when this changes to salesman, we'd like to say hide and show the salary and commission page items. So let's do that. We can use Quick Edit to go directly to that page item, the when item. Quick Edit will take you directly to that item in Page Designer. And now we're here, we can right click on the job item, select Create Dynamic Action. Okay, so that's sort of created the bare bones dynamic action. It's pre-filled some of the when attributes. So it pre-fills the item based on where which item is selected in the tree. It makes a good guess at the kind of most common event type, but you can change that if you want to. In this case, we do want change. And it's created one true action. We'll come on to that in a second. What we need to add is the condition. So we're going to say exactly the same when item P5 job. It could be a different item depending on your needs. And we'll say equal to salesman. And okay, so that's the condition. Then we can move down. Let's give it a suitable name as well. That's always a good idea. And I find that it's useful to name the dynamic actions to be sort of synonymous with the event that takes place. Because you've got kind of one event and then multiple actions, it makes it, in my opinion, easier to identify what a dynamic, when you're kind of coming back to a page that you developed before. Just doing it by event usually kind of gives you a good steer as to what the dynamic action does. And it also helps to kind of avoid having multiple actions on the same event, on the same item. So we'll call this job item changes, and we'll go to the true action. And in this case, we'll say show, and we want to select the commission, and let's say the salary. And then Page Designer provides us a helper facility to create the opposite false action. So we can right click on the true show action, select create opposite, and that will pre-fill with hide and pre-fill with the suitable affected elements. So let's save that and run our page. And then if we, at the moment we can see that as the page loads, job is equal to president, and we can see that salary and commission are hidden. So there's a small helper feature of actions which says fire on initialization, and that will basically just, it's not always suitable, and in some cases it can be definitely not suggested, But for these kind of cases like show and hides, where you've got some logic which controls the visibility of other items, it can be helpful to run that same logic on page load. And you don't need to create like a separate dynamic action, page load dynamic action to do the same thing. You can just use this sort of helper facility built into the actions. The situations where that may be less useful would be probably more like kind of custom PL SQL code, things that interact with the server, where you don't necessarily want to be going back to the server after or sort of shortly after page load. But we'll come on to, that's actually one of the bad practice examples, which we'll come on to later. Okay, so yeah, that's the page, that's page loaded. If we change it to salesman, we can see that salary and commission have been displayed as expected. We can also show that in the console so that you can see the output. So we talked about the fact that when debug was enabled, you can actually see what dynamic actions are firing on the page. Okay, so yeah, so here we can see on page load, as expected, our job item changes, dynamic action has fired. But you can see the action name, so native hide. This is the, so in this case, the condition evaluated to false, which means that the false action is triggered.
Anthony, could you just go over how you actually open up that debug window again for me, please? Oh,
yeah, sure, no problem. So I used a keyboard shortcut on the Mac, but let me show you how you do it. So if you go to the, in Chrome, it will be in More Tools and under Developer Tools. And there'll be something similar in Firefox as well. I forget the exact way to get in there, but so yeah. So if you have a look at the settings menu of the browser and then Developer Tools, that should load you up into the, and then you want to go to the console specifically. That's where you can actually see the output, not under any of the other tabs. Okay, so yeah, so we can see what dynamic action has fired, what action has fired, and then we give you sort of all of the metadata about the action. We can see the event, we can see the specific element, which is the when element, where it was triggered from, and we can see some other stuff about the action type and the affected elements. So in this case, the salary and commission field. So it gives you a good amount of information to be able to see what's going on the page. And then we can change, we'll change and try and fire the true action. Job equals salesman, and there we go, we get the native show with the same metadata output. Okay, that's a basic example. Let's move on to some more examples. And we'll show you one PL SQL based one, and to show you how easy that is as well. So let's go to dynamic, and page 13. Okay, so here we have a page with no dynamic actions enabled at the moment. We have a couple of read-only page or display-only page items, and there's already some logic built into this page which calculates the location name and the number of employees for a specific department selected. So it gives you sort of additional information about the department. However, it doesn't tell you after you've changed the department, and that's what we want. We want it to automatically update based on the current department selected. So again, a perfect use case for dynamic actions. We're kind of enriching the usability of the page, and let's have a look to see how that works. So again, we'll go to the page. We go to the page item, the when. So when does the dynamic action fire? And in this case, it's when department changes. So again, we go down in the rendering tree, go down to P13 Depno, which is our department page item, to create dynamic action. Again, it's pre-filled based on based on where we've selected in the tree. And actually, I'm happy with that. And I don't want a client-side condition. I just want this to always fire whenever the department is changed. So let's go straight to well, let's give it a name. Give it a good name. So department changes. And we go to our true action. There's no false actions in this case because there's no client-side condition. And here we're going to say set value. Set value gives you a number of set types, some of which are just client-side without needing to go to the server, but some do need to go to the server, and they'll kind of inherently create the AJAX call behind the scenes and deal with all of that for you. So you don't need to worry about any of that. So all we do is just say SQL statement in this case. There are other options, PL SQL expression, function body. But in this case, yeah, we're just going to say SQL statement. And here's our SQL statement, which will pull in these location and does a count of the number of employees. It does reference the P13 depnode page item as a bind variable, something to bear in mind in a moment. And we'll click OK. And then in the items to submit, this is important because we need to provide that page item. So that's basically just telling Apex to update that value on the server such that when the query is executed, it can be accurate based on the just selected department number. Okay, so that's the SQL statement. We've done items to submit. It's a set value of type SQL statement. All we need to do now is the affected element. So what items are going to be set with these results? And with SQL statement in the set value action type, it's done sort of positionally based on the SQL query. So the first column in the query is location, and the second column is employees. And we do have 2 page items with those details. So we'll say P13 location, P13 number of employees. So it is positional based on the order of the columns in the SQL statement. That's all good. Let's save that. And run the page. Okay, so same as before. We've got the server-side logic. I didn't show that actually. Let's just show that here. So we've got some pre-rendering, a similar SQL statement, which basically runs when the page loads. So we don't use dynamic actions to update that after the page is loaded. We can just use standard Apex rendering functionality. So we're avoiding the cost of that additional AJAX call. You could modularize that, have it as a function returning values, so we're not repeating the SQL statement in 2 places. But, so yeah, so that's what's kicking in when the page loads. But now if we select a different department, the dynamic action kicks in and updates those items dynamically. We open the browser console again and go to network this time. This can be useful to see. So we're looking at all of the AJAX calls on the page. If we reload the page, okay, so there's a problem, right? Because it has actually updated that on load as well. And I would always suggest to have a look at the network console for exactly that reason, that you can see what other AJAX calls are being made. So in this case, what I can do is turn that off on page load. So if we go to the set value and go down to execution options, we can see that this fire on initialization is set to yes. We can set that to no, so we avoid the cost of that extra AJAX call. Rerun the page. Okay, good. So that looks better. You can see location and number of employees are correct. And as we select different departments, there's the AJAX call that Apex is making behind the scenes. So yeah, so that's a more dynamic example, an example using more dynamic functionality, making AJAX calls to the server. I'm now going to walk through some of the other some of the other examples from the sample dynamic actions application. This is available to install with every workspace in Apex. So if you haven't done so already, I recommend install it under, if you go to the app gallery and sample apps, you can install all of our sample applications from there. It's very easy. And there's a bunch of other samples for interactive grid, universal theme samples. It's a fantastic resource. So yeah, so today I'm showing you the dynamic action sample application, but with a few additional examples in just for today. So let's walk through some of these other ones. So there's one for style, which I wanted to show you, called Stripe Report. So this is basically just a dynamic action that fires and it updates. It sets this sort of alternating row color in the report. And this, I wanted to show you because it's a very simple plugin that's been written to handle this functionality. In Page Designer, it's a standard report. If we go to the Dynamic Actions tab, you can see Stripe Report. And within this dynamic action, we're just selecting the region. So that's the interactive report. And we're selecting it after refresh. So it's whenever the interactive report refreshes, we'll fire this dynamic action straight afterwards. And then we're going to call our Stripe Report plugin, which is basically just setting a custom color. And again, it has the fire on initialization set to yes, so that it will fire when the page loads, as well as after the refresh of the interactive report. So in terms of page level kind of code, very simple, no custom JavaScript. And this is a good way that you can kind of hide custom JavaScript into the plugin. And that kind of helps in terms of maintainability and making code easier to manage and such. So if we have a quick look at the plugin, so we'll go to Share Components, Plugins, Highlight, and then it's pretty straightforward. There is basically just an attribute for color, and then in the JavaScript file, we can see that, so this is kind of, there's some custom logic in here to, oh, sorry, I've chosen the incorrect plugin. My apologies. So this should be the Stripe Report plugin. So again, we'll go to Files, Stripe Report. Okay, apologies for that. So yeah, so this is basically the kind of custom JavaScript code. We're looking at the triggering element, which is the when. So the plugin user doesn't have to kind of reselect the affected elements. We can just refer straight to the triggering element. And there's some custom, sort of custom jQuery selector, and we set the stripe color. We set the background color based on the stripe color that the user has provided. So kind of rather than have any kind of custom jQuery selectors built on the page, this can be hidden and hidden away into the plugin. And then in terms of page level use, it's much easier to manage. Okay, so the next one is our REST refresh example. So this is using NASA's Astronomy Photo of the Day REST API. I'm not going to get too much into the details of how this works from a REST perspective, but I'll show you the key parts. But it's powerful for dynamic actions because you can we can update the report, or in this case, it's a list view, dynamically with dynamic actions without reloading the page. So I've got a few pre-canned visual examples from the REST API. So we can basically provide a date there's a date filter, there's a go button, which triggers a dynamic action, which refreshes that region on the page. So let's have a little look at how this is working behind the scenes. It's very straightforward from a dynamic action perspective. Okay, so if we go to the first part of defining the REST interface is to go to shared components and web source modules. And in here, I've already defined this web source module, which basically defines the URL and the parameters in a way that can interact with that underlying API. So yeah, and one of the parameters is date. So the API supports providing a date, which allows you to select the appropriate day for the photo. That's all good. At page level, we have a list view region called Photo of the Day, which is our section on the right of the page here. And in here, there is page items to submit. So this will get submitted. And this maps to the parameters. So the parameters that you define in the web source module appear in Page Designer, and you can map them to specific page items on the page. And then within the attributes for the region type, it's very simple. It's just showing the title. These are specific columns that are returned by the REST API. And sort of most significantly is that the image comes from a URL, again, which is returned by the REST API. And that's the column as defined by the REST API. So that's all kind of outside of dynamic actions. All you need to do with dynamic actions, once that's set up, is a standard refresh dynamic action. So the when is when this go button is clicked. So when this button is clicked, no condition, because we always want the action to fire after it's clicked. And then very simply, it's a refresh action type. Again, this is one of the ones that will cause an AJAX call. So to be used with care and to monitor through the network tab in the browser console to ensure that you're not doing too much. But yeah, so a refresh action, and then you basically just select the region type. This is our interactive, this is our list view region. And that's really it. We're not going to do it on load because it already renders on load. So, and everything else is taken care of. So we can just, yeah, go in and select. That hit go, that fires the dynamic action, the refresh dynamic action, and that's making that REST call. So yeah, pretty straightforward from a dynamic action perspective, kind of agnostic to the underlying region and region implementation. Assuming the region has been developed with support for refresh, then it'll just work from dynamic actions. The idea is to keep dynamic actions as simple as possible and hide the implementation away in the actual plugin. So yeah, that's a REST refresh example. Let's have a look at another example now, which is for modal pages. Okay, so here we have a, excuse me, here we have two interactive report regions. And what we'd like to do is show a success message and refresh the report when the dialog closes. So if we open this form page in Apex, this is just a standard interactive report and modal form page. If we update the salary, or actually let's do something that's visible on the page. So 19th of November, apply changes. We can see that the report has been refreshed, and also we get a success message specific to that interactive report region, so employee. If we do something similar to the department's interactive report, change the department name, apply changes, we can see again the department has been refreshed, and we show a relevant success message. So the way this works in Apex on the page is actually with just one dynamic action. We've got, these are our two regions, employees and departments. And then the dynamic action is defined, it's called employee dialog closed, which is named after the event, again, to help you kind of work out when it's triggering by the name. Then there's something slightly different here, which we've not seen before. So the event is dialog closed. That's a built-in framework event within Application Express. Previously, we've had a selection type of item or button in the case of the REST refresh. Other things that are supported there are column for interactive grid columns, for example. But here we're using a jQuery selector, and that's basically saying, give me all of the elements on the page that match this T-region class, which is basically those two regions both have that class. So we're pinpointing those two regions. And here what we can do to aid performance a little bit is we can set an event scope. And by setting this to dynamic, basically what that's going to do is define one dynamic action actually at document level. If you don't provide anything for the static container, it defines it at document level. But then it will limit the dialog close. It will limit the actions that get triggered only for the two regions on the page. So, so it's a useful performance boost in terms of you don't want to create too many dynamic actions based on the same event on a page, or multiple dynamic actions on multiple similar sort of links, for example. So yeah, so here we're saying, okay, so create one at document level, and we'll pinpoint specifically to the T-region class, so those two regions. And then if we look into the actions, we're going to refresh the triggering element. So here previously we've used like an item or a region to hide or show that item. But there's a nice shorthand method here, which is how I could do this all with one dynamic action, where you can say just the triggering element. So what's the when element which has triggered this dynamic action? And in this case, that refers back to that region where the event originated. So we can just say, we can keep the dynamic action quite generic. We can pinpoint those two regions with the jQuery selector, and we can use the triggering element to specifically act upon the certain element where the event originated. And then, so we've refreshed the report. The other part of this is the success message. So if we go to the next true action of this dynamic action, we can see the Apex message show page success API or function. Apex message is a documented JavaScript API. Arguably, there should be a built-in action type for this, so you wouldn't have to write that little chunk of JavaScript. It would be entirely possible to create a dynamic action plugin to do this, and there may well be one already there that I've not seen. But so yeah, so it's a simple call to this one API, and we can also drill into the data that's passed in from the event and pull out that success message. So yeah, so that's how it works. Just one dynamic action takes care of all of that functionality for those regions on the page. Okay, so I'm just going to show one final example, and then we're going to move into a few more slides and then into Q&A. So I wanted to show that it's not just about those simple cases, so the kind of shows and hides and simple AJAX calls to the server. There's basically whatever you can do in JavaScript and on the client side, potentially you could wrap up as a dynamic action plugin and expose to developers in an easy way where they don't have to define JavaScript. So I'll just show you the documentation for this first. So there's a plugin called Extend IG Toolbar. which is basically a way of customizing the interactive grid toolbar, but without needing to know JavaScript. In the doc for interactive grid widget, there's this example for copy default toolbar. And it basically shows you how you can use JavaScript and JavaScript APIs to kind of get the to add a button to the toolbar. So you basically do copy default toolbar. You find the relevant group in the toolbar. It's managed as an array, so you add that button to the array, and then you kind of set that back to the toolbar, and that's all done as part of interactive grid initialization. So that works. It's documented now, which is much better. But it is possible for plugins to be able to kind of obfuscate all of that functionality, all of that code within the plugin, such that a page Apex developer can just go to their page, and there's a dynamic action on page load called add interactive grid buttons. And this is calling that plugin, the extend toolbar. Kudos to Marco Gariti. This is his plugin. It's awesome. So wanted to show it as an example of what's possible with dynamic action plugins. There's a whole host of other ones available on Apex Well. So just take a look at that to see what else is possible. So here, instead of writing all of this JavaScript to define the action that's associated with the button, where the label goes, the fact it's a button, where it sits in the toolbar, it's all declarative, right? So you can just say group position, group, icon only, the icon class, where it's positioned, and the action name. So it's basically kind of low coding that JavaScript chunk from the documentation into an easier to use format and a low code format on the page. So that's nice. And you can see here you've got this download button, which has been added to the toolbar declaratively through the plugin. Okay, I think that concludes the demos, with the exception of a couple of things which I'll come back to a little later. So if we go back to the slides. Okay, so bad practice. A few things to look out for and avoid when you're working with dynamic actions. So the first thing is overuse. Dynamic actions, they offer a great deal of functionality, but we've seen examples where there's lots and lots on the same page, maybe sort of upwards of 20, in some cases sort of closer to 50. And that can cause problems in terms of maintainability. It's harder to debug, especially if you've got multiple dynamic actions based on the same or similar events with slightly different conditions. It can be a real headache to sort of both maintain and debug that kind of code. So we would always recommend to kind of try and keep the number of dynamic actions to a minimum, and try and consolidate ones where you've got ones that are firing based on the same event. Look at plugins where it's quite complex. If there's complex logic, it could be that you're better off putting something into a plugin rather than having lots of separate dynamic actions. Also to bear in mind that every dynamic action you add to a page will slightly increase the page size that gets rendered. And this isn't sort of cached or anything. It's not like other JavaScript code, other code in JavaScript files or libraries. This will add to the weight of every page. So it's in your best interest to try and keep the number of dynamic actions to a minimum, just in terms of simplicity, maintainability, and performance as well. So the second thing is page load Ajax calls. So again, use the built-in Apex rendering functionality to set values, to kind of update values on the page, to set session state, rather than using page load dynamic actions. it's really best to avoid those additional AJAX calls if you can. And we saw an example of that when I created that the department changes set value dynamic action. I needed to turn off the fire on initialization flag because that was already handled by the page. Number 3 is too much JavaScript code. So there's lots of hooks within dynamic actions that allow you to provide custom JavaScript code. There's even an execute JavaScript code action type. They're very powerful. I definitely don't suggest you don't use them. But what I would suggest is just always have a think about if that's the best way to do something. And if there is lots of custom JavaScript code going into lots of actions on the page, again, that can be hard to debug. It's code that you have to maintain. And it could be a case where you'd be better off putting it into a plugin, a dynamic action plugin, having the code once in the plugin, and then just using that on different pages. And finally, neglecting security. So these cases, for example, where you're hiding or showing buttons or hiding or showing fields on the page, they're just JavaScript. So in the same way with any JavaScript, if you're whatever you're doing in JavaScript, you need to mirror on the server side. So if it's hiding a button, if you're not an administrator, or depending on, probably that's an extreme case, but even the case where you're hiding items like the commission item, it would be entirely possible for someone to go into developer tools and show that within developer tools, provide a value for that and save it if you haven't protected it on the server as well. So Apex validations, PL SQL logic, all of that stuff, as I'm sure you do anyway, to protect your data on the server side, you still need to do, even if you're kind of hiding it or sort of customizing the UI with dynamic actions. So just something to bear in mind. Okay, so just a quick slide about possible future. So we've got a few ideas for the future, here are the key things, really, just to sort of show you what direction we're thinking of going in. Simplified creation in Page Designer. So we did show creation of a couple of examples there. It is a little bit cumbersome to sort of walk through. You have to go to the true action, create the opposite if it's those sort of show, hide, disable, enable kind of scenarios. What we'd like to have is a very simple dialogue where you can define the when, the action, the affected elements in one go, in one dialogue, create, and then you're done, rather than create it and then go and sort of customize the properties. So yeah, simplified creation in Page Designer, better discovery of existing dynamic actions, especially in the case where you've got maybe lots on a page. It can be difficult in Page Designer to kind of discern what's going on and understand which dynamic actions are doing what. So we want to make that easier, easier and easier to maintain, so that you can more easily see what dynamic actions are doing on the page and what actions are being affected. Sorry, what affected elements are being, what's being updated by dynamic actions on a page. So make that a bit easier in the future. More extend the standard functionality. For example, maybe there'll be some sort of more component-specific dynamic actions to kind of try and take you away from the need to do custom JavaScript code. So no doubt you'll see that expand. Action level conditions is something we've wanted to do for a long time, which is basically at the moment you just have the ability to define the condition at the when level, the event level. But what would be very useful would be to just have this item changes, no condition, and then within the actions have conditions. So you could sort of, if it was a select list, for example, you could have actions within one dynamic action with conditions, so that you could respond to the different values from the select list all within the same dynamic action. That would, I think, greatly help with reducing the number of dynamic actions that sometimes get added to a page. So action level conditions. And then Apex Action support. So Apex Actions is like a JavaScript module which is documented. It underpins interactive grid and a lot of functionality in Apex, but there's no facility or really good integration between dynamic actions and the Apex action library, JavaScript library. So, okay, so that's a bit about the future direction. We are going to move on to some questions now. And I have got a couple of questions which were sent in advance, which I'd like to address first. So if we go back to my demo app. So the first one was about delegated events, basically. You can see the question at the top, and it was how to do this in dynamic actions, where you've got the document, the event, and the class. So that's this delegated event handling that we were talking about earlier, where you can just define one dynamic action to sort of capture change events, but filter it to be only relevant for elements that match this class. And this is entirely possible in Apex today. Very similar to as before. So if we go to this page, we can see basically it's just, we do change the jQuery selector selection type and my class. So the when definition corresponds to the sort of the delegated filter in the jQuery handler. So this is the filter of what specific elements that this will act upon. And just by defining this as dynamic here, the default is static. So you don't see that by default, but change it to dynamic. And then that will create this document-based event, which will then listen for any change events bubbling up, but filtered by this class. So yes, definitely possible. Just look at the event scope in Page Designer. The second question was about WebUtil and forms. So someone coming up from a forms background where they wanted to execute SQL scripts on the host. And this was previously possible with the WebUtil functionality provided by Oracle Forms. This definitely isn't possible in terms of what's standard and not really a limitation of Apex, more just of browsers that they don't provide any access to the host system. And that's by design. But what I would say is you could take a look at this Apex client extension, which is an open source project, which basically it uses the Electron framework to sort of make desktop style applications that can interact with the desktop, but using an Apex app as the application. And within there is I haven't looked into this in great detail, but there is a shell API which could allow you to do some things in that area. But it's basically like Electron sort of creates this sort of wrapper around the Apex application, which allows you to build more of a kind of a tightly integrated desktop app, which would need to be deployed at certain, it's a different deployment model, not just like an Apex app, which is hosted. It would need to be installed and deployed to different hosts. But yeah, so not directly possible with Apex and with modern browsers in general, but take a look at the the ACE browser or Apex client extension, which could provide something like that in the future for Apex applications. Okay, I think that's pretty much it for the standard questions and presentation. So, David, if we'd like to open up to...
Sure, I've got a lot of questions here. The first one's from Jeffrey. One thing I've never quite solved was trying to have a spinner show while other dynamic actions were executing. When I've tried it, the spinner wouldn't start until after the PL SQL action had completed, even though the show spinner action appears first before the PL SQL call. Any ideas on what I'm doing wrong? I know it's a bit low level, but just, can we make it more generic? And what do you do if things aren't firing the way you expect them to? Is probably a good way to try and answer that.
Yeah, so that's not really easy to do currently within dynamic actions. Yeah, I'd have to...
We'll take that one offline. I've got a lot more to get through.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
From Alistair was requesting action level conditions, and you already covered that one, so I'm going to skip straight on to Shig, who asks, there's an option for a page item to use a required template, such as a red asterisk. Can we define a dynamic action to turn that on and off?
Yes, absolutely. So that would be, a dynamic action. You'd need to create a dynamic action plugin, which could kind of look into the DOM and sort of do the specifics around hiding and showing the required asterisk. So you could have like a hide required and show required action type, for example. But yeah, nothing natively available, but you could easily use an action plugin to define that logic to sort of pinpoint the asterisks and hide it and show it based on whatever condition you want on the page. So
excellent. Okay, the next one is from Eric. What are some suggested best practices when writing your own JavaScript for dynamic actions? I've seen some people suggest namespacing, all the custom functions, static JS files, or inline.
Good question. Yeah. So I think
it is a good question. That's why I asked it.
So I think general good practice in terms of JavaScript development. If things can be in files, then that would be recommended because they can be cached. I think that the smaller amount of custom JavaScript code that you've got actually within the dynamic action, the better. Whether that's in separate library files or whether that's packaged up as plugins. It's always a good idea to namespace your code because then it's not polluting the global namespace. So yeah, I would think nothing really specific to dynamic actions other than just general good practice, I'd say.
Okay. The next one here is how to display a user-friendly error message from the PL SQL dynamic action.
That is a good question. Yeah, so there is an API to show the error message, Apex Message API. Oh, yeah. Oh, this is the old doc.
That's all right. We can answer this one back in Slack or what have you after the call. So I've got a few more to go through and we're almost at the top of the hour.
Yes, there is...
okay, sorry, I'll let you finish.
Show errors. Yeah, so there's a show errors API documented, which is what you can use to display error messages. I'd have to, have to have a think about that. That would be tricky from the standard execute PL SQL code API. I need to think about that one, sorry.
Yep, not a problem. And then, okay, there's another one here where, so I'm just running through these. Will there ever be a way to create a sort of cascading dynamic action? If one dynamic action is true or false statement is met, another dynamic action can use that to be triggered.
So yeah, that's a good thing to consider. Like, it is possible currently with some custom code to sort of trigger a dynamic action from another dynamic action, but it could be could become quite tricky to maintain that kind of logic. But we might look at some, I think, a simple supported API to trigger the action could be something to consider. So yeah, we'll have a look. But yeah, it is possible. I think there's some examples out there where you can trigger dynamic actions from other actions using, using the custom events. So there's custom events, and you can trigger a sort of my custom event from one in JavaScript code, and then have another dynamic action based on that custom event. So it is possible today, but just probably be wary because it could be quite tricky to sort of manage that chaining and the dependencies.
Okay. I've got another one here from Paul. On the security, when I have a dynamic action that updates a hidden item, I often hit the protected value error. What are the dangers of just turning off the value protected property on a hidden item?
Well, that's a sort of more general security question. And you should, it depends on what the item is doing. So if it's just some sort of, if it's just something that's used for, like sometimes in dynamic actions, you can use hidden items as more like a variable store. So you can have something that returns a value and then something else responds to that value that's been returned. And it's just presentational, it could be just, pull this, select this employee, we pull back the employee ID. And then when the employee ID changes, we fire some other thing to maybe, show a chart specific to that employee that's been returned. And I would think in that case, it's probably safe to make that unprotected because, even if that did get changed and the page gets submitted, it's not going to cause any harm because there's no sort of server logic which could be influenced by that. I think if it's something like more like a sort of a hidden key from a standard form in Apex, and you want to kind of update that based on some dynamic actions, then I would certainly steer clear of that case because there's sort of server logic associated with it. Maybe you can update certain records that you shouldn't be able to. So I think it sort of depends on the use case, but I think in some cases it is safe to turn off where there's no risk of any kind of sort of saving or server updates that you wouldn't want to happen.
Okay.
On case by case basis.
So I know we're closely running out of time here, but I've just got a couple more I'd like to ask you. Next one here is from Santosh. If I conditionally disable items value, then it is not updating in the table when I press the save button. How can we avoid this?
Yeah, so that is the current functionality of disable. I think that you can work around it by using the read-only attribute. So you could set an item to be read-only. Ideally, that could be a plugin, a dynamic action plugin, where you update the read-only attribute of the item. And there may well be actually plugins on Apex World that already handle this, but so you can work around it by setting the read-only attribute with custom code, and yeah, you could wrap it up as a plugin, but not currently. Currently, that is a shortcoming of the framework where anything that's disabled will not save the value when it's saved. So default functionality, you can work around it.
And the last question we're going to have time for today is from Nicole, and she has a validation set on an item to run PL SQL to check the value in a table, and they wanted the validation to run before the dynamic action, but the dynamic action always runs before the submit page, and she's wondering if you can run validations before you run the dynamic actions.
So it depends what the dynamic action is doing. Does Nicole say what is it?
No, she did. Well, I'd have to scroll back up, and it's not going to be easy to find. There was a lot of chat. Oh, here we go. I found where she's asking for it. Yeah, she doesn't say in enough detail. Nicole, what I'd like you to do is to repost your question on the Slack channel with some more details so we can start a conversation there. I think that'd be best. So with that, thank you everyone for attending and for staying with us today. I hope you enjoyed the session, and please join us in another 2 weeks for yet another Apex Office Hours. Thank you very much, Anthony, for your great session, and we look forward to seeing you out and about in the community. And if you're at Open World, come and see us at the Apex Demo Grounds. So thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye for now.